Hello, and welcome to this week's edition of Found Friday. It's May 1st and a beautiful day here in California. I'm your host, Karen Skates, and with me today is Ray Grieselhuber, our own CEO and founder. Hey, Ray.
How you doing?
Pretty good. How are you?
Pretty good, thanks.
Good. Hey, we're here today to talk a little bit about successful marketing in global markets, and especially in China. Ray, you were recently at EdTech China, which is how this subject kind of came up. And you were actually on a panel that was talking about creating content and managing that. And I was surprised to hear that they're doing content marketing in China. Can you kind of give us a little background about where they are in that whole process and where they've been in the past?
Sure. So China is obviously it's a huge market. It's a really interesting market for a number of reasons. I was also surprised before I got there that we were doing this panel because my impression of China was that it's very much a pay-for-play type user acquisition model because of the influence of sites like Baidu and Taobao and so forth. And that actually turned out to be mostly true. I didn't know a huge amount about the Chinese market before I went in there, and had the chance to talk with a lot of people there. And sure enough, it is definitely just kind of pay all a thing over there. That being said, there is a lot of room for content and well optimized content and high quality content, but it just happens to be a little bit different than the way we do it here. So we'll get into that, during the show today. But it was a really interesting panel discussion overall.
Yeah. Actually, that was going to be my next question. How is content marketing different there? Because I know here, when we talk about content marketing, we keep saying you need to be authentic, you need to be helpful, you need to not be selling your brand, but to be helping your audience to understand the market or solve a problem. Is that the same approach they're taking in China?
I would say overall, no. And the reason is pretty simple. And it's also responsible for the other kind of major difference between content marketing here and in China. In China, you basically pay for traffic. There is no, there are certain things that you can do through social a little bit, some search, some, kind of overall organic means, but basically you're paying for traffic. So what that means from a marketing and sales funnel perspective is that here in the US and in a lot of other markets, just kind of be helpful, be useful first before, add value before you expect to extract value from a customer. All of that relies heavily on the idea that you can acquire traffic that you don't necessarily have to pay directly for. And so you can use those sorts of techniques to get people into your funnel. So it's a very much like top of the funnel situation. Whereas in China, the underlying assumption is that you're paying to get people into your funnel. The question is, what do you do from there in order to convert them? And so broadly speaking, the biggest difference between content marketing here and in China, and you might even debate about whether it's called content marketing or kind of more like content optimization, because in China, once you have people on your site or on your store on Taobao or so forth, it's much more about converting them. So conversion optimization is much more important. Leading people directly towards exactly what you want them to do is much more important as well.
So how is it the same? Is it the same just because of the type of content that they're creating?
Blogs are a thing. One of the things that was surprising was actually more important than blogs and a lot of the other types of content we get involved with. The one area where I do see a lot of branding kind of conversations and opportunities, and also opportunities to build up some more of like an organic user base is in forums. Forums are obviously big here in the US, but they're absolutely huge in China for a lot of different types of products and services. So smart companies need to be very keyed in on managing their reputation on forums, monitoring all of that information, making sure that if someone says something negative about them, that they're in there engaging with people. And so that's probably the closest thing that we have to what we have in the US, where you don't necessarily want to be overselling what you're doing, but you do want to be as authentically as possible engaging with your customer base.
So are they doing things like video and putting them on those forums? Are they preparing content and distributing them on those forums? Or
It's
is it more like a
it's much more
conversation?
like conversation. Yeah, it's much more like the what you would think of as like a forum conversation.
Hmm. So while you were there and you were either on the panel or talking to other people, what do you think was your big aha moment? And you thought, marketers back in the US who want to try to be successful here, they really need to know this thing. What was that thing?
The biggest thing that I learned about was the influence that WeChat has. WeChat, some people will know, some people won't know. It's a messaging app. So in the US, we have WhatsApp, we have Facebook Messenger. In Asia, there's Line, and Line has a very small presence here in the US, but it's huge in Japan and some other Asian countries. Viber is another messaging app that was acquired by Rakuten, I believe, and they're not as big, but they're used in some areas as well. The biggest difference that I saw between all of the other messaging apps and WeChat is that number one, WeChat has an insanely huge subscriber base. Something like, I don't have the exact number in front of it, but something like 600 or 700 million people using it. So within China alone. So it's a huge audience. The other thing is the type of stuff you can do with WeChat. In the US, WhatsApp is probably the most, maybe in Facebook Messenger, right along with it, are probably the two most kind of popular messaging apps. And even like Snapchat, which is much more visual based, they have very limited sets of features. WeChat does literally everything. So you've got all the normal chat functionality, messaging, photo sharing, and everything else. Also similar to what Facebook allows you to do, or Line allows you to do, is companies can set up corporate pages within WeChat. So WeChat is used in many ways as the gateway to a lot of different websites. And you can follow companies, you can get mail blasts from, like, message blasts from them and everything else. And so it's, from a marketing perspective, it's really important for companies. And also it's connected to a lot of other services. So there is a Uber competitor in China that has a huge user base, and you can order taxis directly from WeChat. There's payment systems integrated directly with WeChat. There are all types of e-commerce and other sorts of integrations there as well. So it's a massive application, massive platform, and I haven't seen anything like that. So that was definitely a big surprise for me to learn about it. And what that means from a web content management and creation perspective is that the way the front end is kind of all this this application level stuff. The back end meaning when you go to a company site directly through WeChat, you're basically going to a website that, to one degree or another, should be optimized for mobile. And so that's where a lot of the mobile optimization recommendations, even the type that Google puts out, start to become really important. And there's actually today still a very surprisingly large number of sites that are not well optimized for mobile user experience. And so what that means is that you have a big problem with conversions. And so people are just not converting the way they should be. So that's like, the big aha moment for me was the influence that WeChat has. Some of the problems and challenges that I'm seeing companies struggle with right now are, one is that mobile optimization. The other one is also WeChat itself as a platform just does not, they have no incentive to, and they also do not release a lot of data. So if you're a marketer, it's really hard to get information about how successful competitors are on WeChat. It's hard to get information about how successful even you are. You can get some basic subscriber type data, but there's no user targeting data or anything else. So when you want to send out these messages, you're literally blasting your entire audience. There's no way to segment that out. So I don't know if that's going to change. To me, it seems like if WeChat had an incentive to make that sort of targeting better, then that would be a reason for them to change. But I just don't know enough to say whether or not that's the case.
So is WeChat kind of Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn and all the social platforms that Pinterest and all those things lumped into one platform?
Yes and no. So it's probably the closest in terms of the social functionality. The closest equivalent that we have is Facebook, because it'd be like Facebook if Facebook was primarily chat oriented instead of being feed oriented. So the messaging functionality there is very similar. You've got, stickers and, like all that stuff. And that's the primary way that people interact with each other is through WeChat. They don't spend a lot of time on the phone. They don't, they don't have access to any of these other services that we use, unless they use a VPN, because the Great Firewall, I definitely experienced that, through the normal default internet connections, you can't access Facebook or Twitter or any of that stuff. So basically the Chinese internet economy has built replacements for all of that and has their own twist on it, so Facebook is probably the closest, but there are some major differences as well.
Do you think any of the platforms in the US will move to being more of an all-inclusive platform like WeChat? Do you think that there's going to be a market for that in the future?
It's a really good question. The Silicon Valley mantra when you're starting a new company is to have extreme focus on a very simple set of functionality that you can take to large scale. So it's hard to get to scale. It's hard to convince VCs to invest in you if you go in with this story of we're going to do everything. It's probably hard for companies that have, because of that have excelled in one area to expand into other areas. We saw that a lot with Google trying to go into social with Google Plus. They built an expertise around search. They've done very well with email, and lots of other services, but they have not nailed social. They've nailed a certain type of mobile, which is kind of like more the infrastructure level and the OS level, but they haven't nailed the user level of that. Where with Facebook, they've gotten really good at mobile in terms of monetization and social, of course, but they're not good at search, and they probably never will be. So it's really interesting to see the way that this sort of cultural influence has an impact. In China, there's some different things going on there as well. You've got the government basically keeping out any foreign competitor, so that's a huge one. You've got WeChat was not a startup that just kind of came out of nowhere. It's owned by Tencent, and it's basically this huge company, so they can just fund whatever they want to do there, and they're making so much money with their other businesses. They're probably not making money on WeChat right now, but it doesn't matter because they're making so much money with the other businesses that they just keep funding it as long as they want to.
Yeah. So what might surprise brands who want to create a market presence in China? What when they first get there, what are they going to be surprised by?
One of the biggest surprises will be probably that you need to move beyond this concept of you have a website and your goal is to try to drive people to your website. A lot of, especially if you're doing any sort of transaction or e-commerce, because a lot of that doesn't happen on your website. It's going to happen on these other platforms. You may have, we talked about like the back end to these WeChat engagements, so that may be part of it. But the thing is, the users are never going to know that it's your website powering that. They're just going to think it's part of WeChat. The other thing that if you're doing, again, any sort of transaction is you're probably going to be on Taobao. Taobao is the largest e-commerce platform in China. It has two tiers. There's a more corporate private tier where you pay more money, and then there's like the quote unquote free tier. I'm not sure if it's actually free or not, but it's much cheaper and it's much more for sole proprietor type people. The problem with the free tier is that there's not really any security or privacy or way to verify that the merchant you're buying from is actually who they say they are. Where with the corporate tier, there's a lot more of that identity verification, so it's much more secure, but it's also a lot more money. And so you're basically, and also of course Taobao knows that they're pretty much the only game in town in terms of e-commerce. So if you want traffic and if you want customers, you're going to pay through the nose in order to get it. So a lot of companies, they're not making any money on it, but they're basically buying what they hope is kind of long-term market share, but they're being bled for money over the long term. Where there are a handful of companies, obviously, that have made it through and have succeeded, and Uniqlo is actually a good example of a company that's doing well on Taobao, where they're making money hand over fist now as a result, but they had to break into that top tier.
So what do you think about U.S. companies who have already have entered the Chinese market? Maybe they're not having a lot of success Why do you think that is? What do you think the biggest problems they encounter are?
Um, it's hard to say without talking about the company in question, but based on what I heard and what I saw, it comes down to a couple of things. One is how are you um, how committed are you, first of all? If you view this as, oh, we'll dip our toe in the water in China and see if it works for a couple of years and maybe hire a small team there to try to do things, but we'll have them run by like an American manager so we can understand fully what's going on. It's just not going to work. It's number one, it's probably, if it's not already in many markets, it's the biggest potential consumer market out there. India may surpass that at some point for certain markets, but if you're serious about global domination for your market, you've got to be, again, investing in this kind of 100-year plan. It can't be like a 5-year plan. So that's the way companies need to be thinking about it. And I would say that's still very much true. The other thing is if you're going to do it, you need local partners. Unless you have people who have 10 or 20 years of experience in China that you can fully trust, then you're going to need some sort of partnership. Taking the time to vet those people is a huge time-consuming process. There are a lot of foreigners who have been living there for a long time, so there's a good network that you can get into. So a lot of it depends on your own particular business needs and everything else, but you've got to have someone who really knows what they're doing in that market. When you talk about content in particular and website creation and everything else, usually there's this idea of there's a global brand strategy, there's a global marketing strategy, and a global content strategy, and it all tends to be centrally managed from the US. And they basically treat all these different countries as kind of branches where they'll just say, okay, we'll take the content that we created in America in February and, quote unquote, localize it and ship it off to, Japan or whatever 2 or 3 months down the road. It's just not going to work. It doesn't even work in Japan. That's been a long time fallacy that's something that's actually a legitimate way to do things. It doesn't really work anywhere except maybe other European countries, and even then I would question it. But in places like China and Japan, where it's just so different, you really have to create native content, native branding, native strategy. And again, in order to do that well, you need to have people who actually know what that means.
We talked a little bit before about what kinds of brands are really successful there right now. And we talked a little bit about how the Chinese population is really embracing, especially the upper class, is embracing some of the luxury brands. If you're not a big brand name here in the US, are you going to have more trouble there?
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Companies, and this is actually a phenomenon that I've seen in Asia everywhere. Japan is certainly true. Korea is the same. Taiwan is the same. Basically, the brands that do well in their own markets, especially luxury brands, they will succeed because they have this recognition in other countries. If they're perceived as a high value brand in America or in Europe or even in Japan, they have a much better chance of succeeding in China. If you're some company that nobody knows in the US, it doesn't have any sort of global brand recognition, there's no reason to expect that you can go in and suddenly discover or build a market in China that you just couldn't achieve elsewhere. And it makes sense. I mean, China is a country of 1.6 billion people. Like, it's not like there's any lack of business opportunities there. It's not like there's any lack of product companies, especially companies that nobody knows about outside of that market. So why would they want to welcome some new company that's nobody has heard of just because they're foreign? So that sort of brand importance is a really big deal.
Okay, I want to go back a little bit. You touched a little bit on the importance of mobile. Yep. And being optimized for mobile. And do you feel like the companies who are Chinese companies get that, and that they have optimized for mobile maybe more quickly than we have here in the US?
Yeah, I would say, speaking very generally, that's probably true. It's it's hard to make a blanket statement to say that everyone has, of course, because there's probably lots of companies that haven't. But a lot of these companies and a lot of these newer markets grew up with mobile first, so they're very good at it, at doing certain things.
So that kind of takes us a little bit to the new Google algorithm change, the mobile friendly. Um, do you think that, I think there's still US companies who haven't optimized for mobile,
Oh
and
yeah.
maybe feel like that's not important, right? And so it just seems like here in the US and globally, the move is towards mobile. And I just don't know it. How hard is it for companies to understand that, really mobile is the future?
It's been hard for US companies because the desktop based website market has been so big for so long, and you've got an entire generation or two of developers and managers and strategists and everything else who have grown up around that. So it's even though it seems obvious, it is kind of a big shift in thinking. um, I think people are getting it. They're starting to see those mobile traffic numbers exceed their desktop traffic numbers. They're starting to see bounce rates and conversion rates and everything else be pretty abysmal compared to their desktop numbers. And overall, it actually is harder because in many cases, conversions from mobile don't happen as frequently as they do on desktop anyway, because buyers are used to making purchases, in front of their computer, pulling out their credit card and everything else. So we're probably looking at least another 5 or 10 years before companies and user behavior catches up to that reality, at least in the US.
So
In
do you
China,
think, like in China, that the user behavior is already there?
yeah, the
That
user
there's more use on mobile than there on desktop. So companies have to be optimized.
yeah, there's no question. But even with that, they're not. I mean, like a lot of them are. In terms of percentage, a lot of them are, but a lot of them aren't also. So um,
That's
they're
surprising, actually. I'm
well,
surprised.
it's hard. It's uh, optimizing for mobile, especially when you have a big company or a big brand, is takes a lot of work. It requires a very highly educated developer community in order to make that happen. You can't technically, just from a technology perspective alone and from a web content management and creation perspective alone, there's no magic wand that you can just wave and say be optimized. It's a lot of work. It takes millions of dollars of investment, so it's not going to happen overnight.
So just to sort of wrap up, if you want to if someone's watching and they're like, we really think that we want to enter into global markets, maybe not even China specifically, what things should they be thinking about? What are like 5 or 6 takeaways that people can have in terms of their global marketing strategies?
I would say, first of all, figure out if it's actually something that you should be involved in. It's easy to hire people that want to be involved with a global market strategy because it's a sexy thing to say and it sounds good, and all your buddies are doing it and everything else. And so if you're not doing it, you're going to feel kind of like a loser. But you need to decide if it's really the right move for your company. I would say for most multinational corporations, it's a no-brainer. But if you do it, then you've got to do it for real. There's no half-assed, way to do this because, again, this should be a very long-term strategy. You should be in the game to win. And so if you're going to do it, put the money behind it, build the partnership, hire the right people, make the investment. So in order to do that, that almost by definition kind of spells out the type of companies that are going to be successful there, just from a pure financial perspective.
I wanted to go back a little bit to what you said about companies who are even trying to go global, say in the European market, which
Yep.
is at least the same language. Well, if you go to the UK, it's the same language, but culturally a lot closer to us. And you're saying that even just doing what they're doing sometimes is not enough.
You mean in Europe?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Europe it's also a very diverse market. The other thing that's tricky about Europe is uh, the the buying behaviors, the user behaviors are still very different, almost at the country level. So, we've been dealing with the EU now for so long that it's easy to think of it as kind of like one region, but you're dealing with dozens of different markets, languages, budgets, behavior. There are so many countries in Europe where the idea of buying something online seems crazy. So that's a huge hurdle right there. So I think that you need to treat you can't treat Europe. People actually go so far as to, there's organizations within these large corporations where it's not just Europe, but it's EMEA, which is it's even bigger. So you're talking about the Middle East and everything else, and so you're basically grouping like half of the planet into a single region, which makes no sense whatsoever.
So it seems like forming those partnerships and really understanding the culture and the buying habits of each individual country that you're entering in, that seems like maybe something people want to do more of.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
All right. Well, I think that about wraps it up, unless you have some additional insights you wanted to share, something that you heard or found out at AdTech China.
No, I think that pretty much covers it. I think that it was a really interesting experience from that perspective. I learned a ton. I would encourage anyone that is thinking about it to attend the AdTech China next year. It was a nice group of people. There were a lot of foreigners there, so you don't have to necessarily worry about being like the only person from America if you go there. It's I think overall there are probably maybe between 800 and 1,000 attendees, so it wasn't a huge event, but that made it nice because the networking parties and everything else were a good opportunity to really connect with people. So I had a great time. I'll probably do it again next year, and I would recommend anyone who's thinking about it as part of their strategy to do that as a first step.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for your time, and we'll see you next week.
All right, sounds good.
All right, bye-bye.